For those of you who didn't hear me before, I'm Tom Brake, the Director of Unlock Democracy. We campaign for democratic reforms in the UK, and amongst those, health laws reform. We're very fortunate in having Hardeep Matharu and Dr. Robert Saunders with us this evening to talk about one aspect of reform that we campaign on, and that is house laws reform. So please, as I said, do put your any questions you might have into the Q&A. And I'm now going to hand over straight away to Hardeep to take us from here. Thank you, Hardeep.
Thank you, Tom, and welcome to everybody. It's really good to be here this evening to discuss the House of Lords. I'm Hardeep Matharu. As Tom said, I'm the editor-in-chief of Byline Times, which, for those who don't know, is a free daily news site and a monthly print news magazine, which is funded by subscriptions by the public. And our remit is to cover what the other papers don't say. So it's been a really interesting couple of years when we look at democracy from the journalistic standpoint, particularly the House of Lords, actually. The names Baroness Michelle Mone, the PPE scandal, and Lord Evgeny Lebedev spring to my mind. And it feels to me that as never before, people in this country have lost faith and trust in the institutions of their democracy. And so it seems like a particularly pertinent time to be talking again about reform of the House of Lords. But I'm particularly pleased to be talking in conversation tonight with Dr. Robert Saunders, because I think he's going to take us through the evolution of the House of Lords, how its original rationale has changed over the years, and how, to a large extent, reform has always been a part of the upper chamber of the UK Parliament. So I'm really interested to dissect it from those angles. Dr. Robert Saunders is a reader in modern British history at Queen Mary University of London. He is a historian of democracy who has written extensively about constitutional reform from the early 19th century to the present day. Robert's going to be in conversation with me for about 45 minutes, and then we will be taking your questions. So, as Tom said, please do send in any interesting questions, insights, wonderings, and we will try to get to them at about 7:15. Robert, it's great that you're here this evening. I wonder if we can just start with setting out how the House of Lords currently works and what is its modern purpose as the upper chamber of the UK Parliament.
Sure. So what we've got at the moment is an overwhelmingly appointed House. It's not exclusively appointed. There are, as we'll discuss, 92 hereditary peers. There are 23 bishops of the Church of England. But the overwhelming majority, more than 700 members of the House, are appointed life peers. And that's a mix of political appointees. So about a third of them used to be MPs. There are quite a lot of former ministers in there. And people who, in theory at least, have done some kind of national service and are being honoured for that service. So they might be diplomats, or they might be scientists, or they might be disabilities campaigners, all those kinds of things being brought into the House for their expertise. About a third of the House are women, 2/3 are men. No party has a majority at any time, but the largest party by some distance at the moment is the Conservative Party. So that's the kind of makeup of the House right now. In terms of its powers, it has no power over taxation or over finance. And with one exception, it has no power of veto. It can, in theory, postpone legislation for up to a year, but it very rarely does that. So actually, its principal role is as a revising chamber. So it scrutinises legislation, it proposes amendments, and to some extent, it holds government's feet to the fire. So it can take out a particularly contentious or important part of a bill and challenge the government in the House of Commons to put that back again. It also has a committee system that operates things like a Constitution Committee, an Environment and Climate Change Committee, which scrutinises, if you like, the whole realm of public policy and produces very interesting reports. So it's quite an important cog in the machinery of government, but it hasn't got the kind of propulsive power that the House of Commons has.
And what are some of the pros and cons in relation to how the situation stands at the moment?
Well, when I posted about this event on Blue Sky earlier, I got quite a lot of replies saying things like burn it to the ground. And we may come on to that. But I think it is important, therefore, to talk about the things that it does well, if only because any new system that we might want to create, we should be thinking about how we replicate those things. So it does a pretty good job of scrutinizing and redrafting legislation. And those are things that the House of Commons is now really poor at. Most of the serious business of making legislation work happens in the House of Lords. It's got a lot of expertise. There are a lot of really quite serious scientists, Middle East experts, Russia experts, people who know a lot about a particular area of policy in there, of a kind that, again, we don't really find in the Commons because they're just different career paths. It's also got a lot of experience. And again, the House of Commons doesn't do that. More than half of the current House of Commons have been there for less than a year. If you're looking for elder statesmen in the House of Commons, it's, Rishi Sunak, Jeremy Hunt, that's kind of it. So if you want experienced voices in government, there are people in the Lords who were working in the Wilson governments in the 1960s. So it does that. And it's also, I suppose, the final pro would be it's the one bit of the lawmaking machine in which one party never has a majority. And so it's a place where minority parties actually matter and have some kind of a say. So I guess those would be the pros that we can set against the cons.
And what are the cons, if you had to name a few, or what the areas that experts have pointed to which are potentially problematic or don't work as efficiently as they could?
Well, I guess first of all, it's a massive source of prime ministerial patronage. And as you all know better than I do from the work of Byline Times, there's a strong whiff of corruption, frankly, about the appointments process. It's quite difficult to defend a number of the people who have been in there. It's not obviously healthy that a prime minister has such extraordinary power to put people in a legislative chamber. Secondly, it obviously lacks democratic legitimacy. It's clear that the public cares about that. If you ask the public, I think about 12% say that they're happy with the House of Lords as it is. And that also actually means that the House of Lords knows it lacks legitimacy. And to some extent, therefore, it kind of pulls its punches in the job of scrutinizing government. And I think it's probably not healthy to have a chamber of parliament that permanently has the axe of reform hanging over it, in which ministers can constantly say to the House, nice chamber you've got there, shame if anything happened to it. So I think we probably would be better off if we had it would be healthier as a democracy if we had a chamber that enjoyed public support and that was confident about using the powers that were given to it without the fear that government was going to kind of descend with the meat cleaver.
It's really interesting, especially in recent years, and particularly the previous Conservative government. There was sort of two things at once that were happening. There were arguments being made that the corruption element of the House of Lords and what it represents was on full show, but also when it came to certain policies, I think Rwanda was one. There was a notion that actually the unelected upper chamber, was providing that scrutiny, which many people felt that the Commons and certainly the government wasn't really welcoming in terms of the formulation of that policy. But I mean, this Labour government, ahead of its election, was talking a lot about constitutional reform, and there was various work commissioned by Gordon Brown and the like, and this notion of we should turn it into a Senate of the nations, etc. What we seem to have ended up with in terms of reform, tangible reform, is a hereditary peers bill. So I wonder if we could just talk a little bit about that, because that seems to be on the table. But I guess also within the context of reform of the House of Lords, while it sort of seems like a kind of big thing to announce, is often the reality of it is difficult. It's time consuming. It can get in the way of the agenda of a government. And so reform only tends to happen if there is a sort of really major problem that needs to be dealt with. But sort of in light of that, what is on the table in terms of the hereditary peers bill?
So the current bill is a very simple bill. It's smaller than the government proposed in its manifesto. And it essentially just expels the remaining 92 hereditary peers from the House. That's really all it does. And it's essentially unfinished business from the 1990s. So when Tony Blair came to power in 1997, there were more than 750 hereditary peers in the House. And because most of them were Conservative, that had a very striking effect on the party balance of the House. So Blair wanted them out, but he didn't want to spend too long on this. He didn't want the first Labour government since the 1970s to be spending 18 months locked in combat with the hereditary peers. And they were promising what was described at the time as Somme and Passchendaele on the government's programme. So he essentially cut a deal, which was that 92 hereditary peers would get to stay. And in a way, it was a kind of hostage situation, in that the idea was that as long as those 92 hereditaries were still in the House, you couldn't say that House of Lords reform was finished. You would have to come back to it at some point and perhaps constitute a stronger chamber that can challenge the government. But 25 years on, that's never happened. So essentially what Labour is saying now is we're not going to do Big Bang reform, at least not for the time being, but we are going to end this nonsense because this is indefensible. And because much the largest group in the remaining hereditaries are Conservatives, this is also a way of slightly chipping at the very large lead that the Conservatives built up over Labour over the last 14 years.
I mean, how would you describe sort of the composition of the current House of Lords as it stands? I mean, it seems like a bit of a mixed mishmash of hereditary peers who are, 92 of them still remaining, sitting alongside bishops of the Church of England. We have life peers, many of whom are appointed by, as you said, the Prime Minister's patronage. Many of them appointed by an appointments commission, which some argue should be reformed. I mean, how have we ended up in the quite eclectic sort of mix we have in the House of Lords today? And how does that perhaps relate to the changing rationale for the chamber over the years?
It's a complete mishmash. It's a kind of Frankenstein's monster. In a way, it's a bit like a wonderful country house to which you've added an extra wing, you've put a swimming pool in the basement, you've knocked a story off the top, you've built a tower at the side, and what you end up with is something potentially that just lacks all coherence. So if we go back to the kind of 18th and 19th century, before this process of reform you mentioned begins, at that point, the House of Lords has a very clear rationale. It represents the landed aristocracy and the princes of the church. And it does that because those are two of the great power brokers in the country. So the church represents the dominant intellectual system of the age. It has parishes all over the country. It provides much of the schooling, much of the charitable work of the age. Meanwhile, the aristocracy represent the most important economic interest, which is agriculture. It has estates all over the country. It lives on its estates by and large, so it can claim a kind of representative function. These are the richest and most powerful people in the country. And that means, of course, that they're also the people who are best able to stand up to the power of the monarch. So in terms of the development of a balanced constitution that can resist the power of the crown, they play a very important role there. So this isn't a democratic system, but it's a system that makes sense. What then happens is that starts to lose its rationale. Agriculture is no longer the most important part of the constitution. The hereditary aristocracy are no longer the richest and most powerful people. They're not officering the army or filling the courts with their second sons anymore. And increasingly, with the rise of democratization, it's coming to be expected that your political institutions have authority coming from below. So we then get a whole series of kind of piecemeal changes. So in 1911, it loses its power of veto. It loses its power over finance. In the 1940s, its delaying power is shrunk. In the 1950s, you get the introduction of life peerages, which transforms the membership of the House. In the 90s, you get most of the hereditaries gone. And these are probably all changes for the better. But at the end of it, it's much harder than it was at the start to say what the point of this institution is, or what the kind of rationale is that holds it all together. And that's why I think we live in a kind of constant age of delegitimization, of discussion of how we might reform this institution.
And do you think this lack of coherence, which you say it results in that, has practical implications as well? I mean, is it... Do we see that in sort of the day-to-day workings of the House of Lords, or sort of how effective its sort of scrutiny is, or, you know, in a way, that coherence, what are the implications of that?
Well, I'm not sure it has a huge effect actually on how the House actually works in terms
Mm,
of, I think you can make quite a good case that it does a decent job on things like scrutiny of legislation. I think
mm,
it does have a big legitimacy effect. If you have half of your parliament that you can't really explain to the public, then you have a problem. Even if it's not directly elected, it has to have a kind of democratic legitimacy in the sense that people must support the nature of the institution. And it's just very difficult to make that case. And as I suggested earlier, I think it also makes the Lords potentially timid in using the powers that it actually does have. So,
mm,
we might get on later to what it is that we want the House of Lords to do. But to some extent, if we want it to be, a defender of constitutional propriety, or if we want it to uphold certain principles in public life, there is a problem with having a House that knows that it possibly shouldn't be there and that it doesn't have strong public support behind it.
mm. So almost in a more philosophical sense, that coherence sort of is not ideal
Mm.
democratically. So should we have a bit more of a detailed look of some of these significant moments of reform? You mentioned the 1911 Parliament Act and maybe a few others of, what did the reform consist of? What was the motivator behind it? Are there any, I don't know, parallels to modern day opportunities for change and reform that can be made?
Sure. So I suppose there are probably three big ones. The biggest would be 1911, the Parliament Act.
Mm,
And I think a theme of Lord's reform is that, as you said, Lord's reform is very complicated. It's quite difficult. It takes a lot of time. Governments only have limited bandwidth. They generally have other things they want to be getting on with. So they tend only to go into battle on the Lords when there's a problem that they absolutely have to solve. And so in 1909, the House of Lords gives it a problem in that it vetoes the budget. It spent years emasculating Liberal legislation. It's an overwhelmingly Tory assembly in those days. And then in 1909, it votes down the budget. So the Liberal government can't allow that to stand. An elected House can't allow a hereditary chamber to reject its financial measures. So you get essentially 2 years of political warfare. Lloyd George, the Liberal demagogue, if you like, makes a series of wonderful speeches. He says the Lords are 500 men accidentally chosen from among the ranks of the unemployed. He talks about how a fully armed duke costs as much to build as a battleship and does far more harm. And ultimately, after this 2 year struggle, two general elections, they break the power of the House and they pass this act which takes away its power over finance and that abolishes its veto on almost every subject. But there is a warning there, which is that in the process, the Liberals lose their majority in the House. They have to call a general election and they go from a landslide to a hung parliament. Because while the public might kind of support them, it's not a priority by and large for most electors. They want government to be getting on with other things. So that memory is actually important for the kind of half century that follows, that taking on the House of Lords does come with a cost. Not necessarily that the public oppose you, but that they're not going to reward you because they'd rather you were doing other things.
mm. And also 1958, life peerages and the first women in the House of Lords. I was doing a bit of prep for this conversation. I was really surprised by that. 1958, it wasn't too long ago at all.
It's amazing. Less than 70 years ago, this was an all-male assembly.
Mm,
And you can still see the effects of that today in the fact that it's still 2/3 male. So 1958 is another example of recognizing that there is a practical problem which has to be fixed. And in this case, it's the Labour Party. So the Labour Party is not well stocked with hereditary peers. If you're going to have a party system that is essentially the Conservatives versus the Labour Party, then a hereditary chamber cannot possibly represent Labour fairly. So actually Conservatives look at this and see that the House of Lords can't survive this, that if this endures, the House of Lords will fall. So it's a kind of rescue operation, is to say, okay, we're going to give the Prime Minister the power to bring people into the House of Lords from outside who don't have to be sufficiently wealthy that their children and their grandchildren and their great-grandchildren can carry on that role as well. So it's actually a kind of restorative measure but it transforms who sits in the House. And crucially, as you say, it does mean for the first time that women can sit in the House. Ironically, one of the first women to sit is Irene Curtzen, whose father, Lord Curtzen, had led the resistance to women's suffrage during the Edwardian period. So it's an interesting kind of generational shift.
Yeah, that is progress right there. And then when we touched on it a bit earlier, but let's go back to also 1999 with the initial hereditary peers, the first ones that left. We talked a bit about Labour and the sort of what motivated that. But I mean, are there any parallels that we can draw this time round and learn any lessons from what happened back then, or?
Well, in some ways, it's inherited business from the John Smith era. But Blair is quite keen on getting rid of the hereditaries because Blair is fundamentally a modernizer. Blair comes into office wanting to make Britain a modern country, in some ways a more European country. And the idea that you've got 750 people who are in there because their great-great-great-grandparents sort of slept with someone in the royal family, or because they bought their peerage from Lloyd George in the 1920s, he finds deeply offensive. This is a symbol for him of what's wrong with Britain. And it's in some ways meant to be an easy reform because all you have to do is remove a cohort of people. You're not having to come up with a new plan for rewriting the assembly. But even so, he quickly recognizes that actually you either need the Lord's consent for this, or you need to be willing to spend 18 months fighting for it. And this is a government that wants to do all sorts of other things in terms of public services, devolution, that has great plans for government and just doesn't want to expend its political capital on constitutional reform. And that is a key reason why we haven't seen more fundamental reform since. Governments haven't got infinite time and brain space. Once they've got rid of the hereditaries, the current system actually works quite well for governments because this House will never fundamentally challenge their power. And because there's no consensus on what should replace it, there isn't some great kind of tide of popular pressure that's pushing for change. So you can keep putting it off until tomorrow. And actually, it's perhaps just worth saying that the 1911 Parliament Act has at the start a preamble that says it is intended to replace the House of Lords with a new assembly, which will be more democratic and representative. But in the meantime, this is what we're doing, and we are still living in the meantime. So to some extent, the whole history of reform of the Lords is putting off the big picture change and just making these smaller kind of tweaks and corrections as you go.
Yeah, in some respects, I thought it was quite extraordinary that the Labour government ahead of the election, Keir Starmer's government in waiting, promised quite a big package, and then it was watered down and watered down. And perhaps that's actually, obviously, people arguing, why has Labour been timid on reform, which is perhaps valid, but as you say, actually, all we've really ever seen is sort of piecemeal attempts to reform the House of Lords. So it's not particularly out of the ordinary that this government is not prioritising and doing a big package of constitutional reform. It would be a big thing to take on, it seems. So they are some of the key sort of tangible moments. The Parliament Act, 1958, the life peerages come in. What about in terms of convention and how that has shifted over time in line with, wider shifts in how people are thinking about the House of Lords and its purpose? I mean, how has that contributed to, evolving the House of Lords and defining the kind of chamber we find it to be now?
Yeah, the British Constitution is governed as much by conventions as it is by law, and conventions change imperceptibly, but in ways that are really important. So even before the Parliament Act in 1911, the House of Lords sort of recognises that it doesn't have independent authority any longer. An older model in which you have a kind of popular house and an aristocratic house, and they have equal legitimacy, has gone. So they evolve a doctrine, which is that they are a democratic watchdog, which sounds absurd if you're an aristocratic chamber. But the argument is that we now have these very disciplined parties that between elections, if they have a majority in the Commons, can do anything they want. So the job of the House of Lords is to say, we want you to check with the electorate that they're happy with this. So they argue that they can reject anything that hasn't explicitly been authorised in a general election. So if you fought an election on Lords reform or Home Rule, then yes, that will happen. Anything else, you can say no. You've got to go to the country on that. Now, that suits the Tory majority in the Lords very well at that point. It basically means you can veto almost anything that your opponents do. So that gets watered down in 1945 into what's known as the Salisbury Convention. And to some extent, we still have this, so it's important. The idea of the Salisbury Convention is that the Lords will not block anything that is in a party's manifesto. So if you can say we won an election on this manifesto, the House of Lords won't try to stop it. So that's a really important retreat. But it has an accidental side effect, which is that parties then start stuffing as much as they can possibly think of into their manifestos, because then you can get an easier ride in the upper house. So one of the reasons why elections nowadays are these great sprawling documents, which none of us ever read, and which are full of policies often on quite small and abstruse things, is because they want to be able to say to the House of Lords after the election, we have a mandate from the public for bullet point 93 on page 467, and therefore you can't block it.
That's that is really interesting. Yeah. And the democratic watchdog just sounds so paradoxical, doesn't it? But again, I would coming back to that point about what's been happening in recent years. And actually, I think that probably it's become more relevant again, and sort of in some ways bolsters the argument for, at its best, what the House of Lords can provide. We've got a bit more time before we take some questions, and please do keep your questions coming through. They're getting quite a few of them on my screen here, so do keep submitting them. But to sort of take us into the Q&A, we've got to sort of talk about what is the future for the House of Lords. And I guess I could ask sort of what are the various options and what do you think of them, Robert? But I mean, perhaps a better way to do this is what are the sort of questions that we should be considering when we think about House of Lords reform beyond the Hereditary Peers Bill, and just, you know, tinkling here and there with small bits of what's its structure and its system and its purpose?
I think the fundamental question, which we don't ask often enough, is what do we actually want it to do? Do we want it to do basically what it does now? Do we want it to be a revising and amending and scrutinizing chamber, a chamber of expertise that can kind of put grit in the machinery but can't fundamentally challenge the House of Commons? If that's what we want, it's quite difficult, I think, to have an elected House that does that, because you're not going to have the same level of expertise. You're going to have much stronger party discipline and loyalty. And to some extent, people who are elected are going to push against that very limited kind of role. Do we want it to do something more fundamental? So the Brown Commission, which was chaired by Gordon Brown, argued that the House of Lords should become a kind of constitutional guarantor. So it actually proposed restoring the veto of the House of Lords for certain constitutional statutes. So you could say that there are certain policies, like the Human Rights Act, that you can't change just by a majority in the House of Commons, that the Lords would be able to block that. If you want the House of Lords to do that, if you want it to be able to say to a government that's won an election on a manifesto saying, we'll get rid of the Human Rights Act or whatever, then I think it has to have a direct democratic mandate. So then we're going to go down a kind of electoral route. I guess we then have to think about, if we want an elected chamber, how do we want to elect it? How are we going to make sure that it doesn't either just replicate the House of Commons or cause gridlock with the House of Commons? How do we make sure that we don't just get the B team of the organised established parties, of the people that they don't particularly want in the House of Commons? Or if we're going to keep an appointed House, how do we try to make it work better, and how do we try to win legitimacy for that? So I guess there are those questions floating around. But perhaps a larger question might be, what do we want the House of Commons to do? Because actually a lot of what we want the Lords to do depends on that first question and on how we want the House of Commons to be constituted. So, to some extent, if, for example, we think it's really important that minority parties have serious powers in the Constitution, whether they get that in the House of Commons or not depends on what its electoral system is. So some of this depends on what we do at the lower house, and that's a debate that governments and MPs are much more wary of having.
It's a really interesting one because sort of you talk about democratic legitimacy and how important that is underlying all of this. And I completely agree. And just an anecdote, a few people have said, oh, would you ever run for Parliament, Hardeep? And I've always said, no, I would not, because I wouldn't want to have to join a political party. So I've kind of, tongue in cheek said, so if you give me a place in the House of Lords, I could sit as a crossbench peer. I say this as a joke, but I guess the wider point is you can't really look at one without the other. You can't change one thing in a system which is interconnected to other things within that system without it having, it's a feedback loop. And perhaps if the House of Commons became somewhere where independent candidates could more easily or more readily, or it's more usual for them to stand for Parliament, and there's an electoral system that perhaps is more conducive to that. If that shifted, maybe the argument for having crossbench peers in the House of Lords, in my defence of that aspect of it, would diminish. But it is a very interesting one. I mean, how much do you think, without, again, coming back to democratic legitimacy, how much, without drawing, you're an academic, without drawing you into any particular recent sort of scandals or media stories or anything like that, but in terms of the current moment that we're in, do you think this point about democratic legitimacy within the context of the loss of trust in our institutions is particularly pertinent at this point? Or would you say, in all your knowledge of the House of Lords and how the chamber has evolved over years, that this isn't actually a particular point that's crucial for reform, if that makes sense?
I think we should take enormously seriously the fact that there is just a catastrophic crisis of trust in public institutions in Britain at the moment. And I don't think a democracy should ever be relaxed about that. But I certainly don't think we should be relaxed about it in the present moment, when we can point to examples of democratic backsliding all over the world. When, if you look at things like electoral turnout in Britain, there is a real problem with people feeling like their institutions belong to them. And in a sense, even if I think that the House of Lords works reasonably well in all sorts of ways at the moment, actually it matters whether or not people feel trust in that institution. And I think there are two particular issues that perhaps push that to the top of the agenda right now. One, frankly, is the behaviour of recent governments. I think if you're going to maintain an appointed system, you have to ask bluntly, how do you Johnson-proof it? How do you make sure that you can't have a prime minister who uses it in the way that he did? No party's hands are particularly clean on this, but I think that period did bring problems of the House really to the fore. So that's a problem that we've inherited from the recent past. There's another problem, though, potentially steaming towards us on the horizon, which I think Labour should be thinking hard about. And I said earlier, reform tends only to happen when there's a big problem you need to solve. And I think we might have one coming, which is that it is possible that after the next election, Reform UK will either be in government or will be the official opposition. It's maybe not the most likely outcome, but it's entirely possible. Reform UK has zero representation in the House of Lords right now. So in a way, we're back in the problem that Labour had with the House of Lords in 1945. So what do we do in that scenario? Do we say that Nigel Farage can create 200 life peers? Are we happy with that? Do we say, which actually Reform might quite like, that the House has to continue as it is, but will be almost ineffective because it will have such a strong sense that it has a legitimacy problem, that it has no representation from one of the big two parties, that it essentially becomes entirely emasculated. So we do have to think about how a chamber would actually work in a scenario in which it's not just the Conservatives and the Labour Party and the Liberal Democrats who matter politically.
That is a really, quite something to think about. And Robert, is there anything else you'd like to add in this part of our conversation before I open up some questions from our assembled audience?
Very happy to go to questions. I mean, there's all sorts of things that we could talk about, but it looks like questions are coming in. So if people
They
want
are.
to switch, then great.
They are. So forgive me for looking down on my phone, but they're coming in on my phone. So first interesting.
Oh dear.
Sorry, Hardeep, was jumping in too quickly. You're back.
I'm back. Sorry. I feared this would happen. Right. I'm going to go to the first question if everybody can hear me. Am I here? Okay, so the first question is from retired peer, Lord Tyler. And so Lord Tyler's question: to avoid the weaknesses described by Robert and create a more democratic House, why not simply retable the 2012 Lords Reform Bill, the outcome of decades of cross-party consensus and voted for by a huge majority of MPs?
Well, we could do that, but I suppose ultimately, why didn't it pass in the first place? Which is that there wasn't actually the political will to push it forward. And people never like voting against Lord's reform because it kind of looks bad. But there clearly wasn't actually majority support for that in Parliament. It's a solution that's out there, of which there are many, but I guess I'm not really sure why that one is going to rebuild public consent.
An anonymous question on the remaining bishops in the House of Lords. What is the justification for keeping the bishops in the House of Lords, in particular context of fewer people identifying as Church of England adherents?
So again, this is obviously a relic of a former version of the House from the days when this was not just one denomination, but it was the established religion of the country that you could broadly assume had majority popular support. It's clearly not something that you would do if you were creating a house now. It's clearly a massive problem that in a multi-faith society and to a large extent a non-faith society, you have one denomination that has a privileged representation in the house. In practical terms, I don't think we should exaggerate its importance. There are 23 bishops out of 834 members, I think, in the House. So we're talking about, 2.7% of the House. So, people sometimes say only the UK and Iran have theocratic systems. This is not theocratic. It's just a kind of odd relic. If we're going to have an appointed House, I don't think it's a terrible thing to have representatives of organized religions. If we're going to have representatives of other kinds of community or activity or expertise, it's not necessarily a terrible thing to have people who speak for faiths. There's obviously a problem of only having one faith institutionalized. So if we were going to keep an appointed House, I think there'd be quite a strong case for saying, right, we're going to reduce the number of bishops, and we're also going to set up a system that means that we have representatives of Judaism, Islam, Hinduism, and so on as well.
An interesting question from Dan. Do we even need a second chamber? Sweden and New Zealand seem to do fine without one. Should we just abolish the House of Lords, Robert? Is that even feasible?
It can be done. It's been done before during the Civil War. It's true that there are countries that only have one chamber. There aren't that many. Most do have two. And I think there are good reasons for that. I think it's quite a good thing to have sort of two institutions that can look at legislation as it goes through, that have different makeups and have different interests, especially in a system like ours, where you can win 34% of the vote in a general election, and that can give you a majority over all other parties. That's, up there with the Attlee government of 1945. So we could get rid of it, but we would have to ask, how would we make sure that the things it does well still happen? So given that a lot of legislation that comes out of the House of Commons is a complete disaster zone, how do we make sure that it's properly redrafted and amended? Given that scrutiny in the House of Commons is really poor right now, how do we make sure that there is serious scrutiny? How do we make sure that minority parties actually have a voice? How do we institutionalize a system that requires governments to think again when they're proposing something that's really hot button or controversial. Now, you could do that within the House of Commons, but you'd need quite serious reform of the House of Commons to do that. So I think just getting rid of it would be massively empowering to government. That's something that a strong executive would really, really like. But we could do it if we reconsidered the House of Commons more fundamentally.
And Robert, could you say a bit more about the scrutiny function? Because, I mean, to my mind, it's actually a really important role. And just to hear you say, you know, actually that level of scrutiny to get that in the House of Commons, because obviously the Commons is dominated by the executive, by the government's mandate, and therefore scrutiny of its policies, it's very difficult. I mean, even that sounds so extraordinary that you have a House of Commons of elected representatives, and yet the scrutiny is lacking. It's better than the House of Lords. Could you say a little bit more about the scrutiny and perhaps a few pertinent examples that come to mind of recent years in which that scrutiny process has, you know, delivered us better legislation?
Yeah, it's very much to the discredit of the House of Commons that it performs this role so badly. And that's partly, I think, because it's usually dominated by members of the governing party. And the priority of the governing party is, of course, to get its legislation through. And while there will always, of course, be independent-minded and interested people on the governing party's benches, there is a pressure not to make life difficult for your own front bench. You've obviously got the opposition parties, but they're institutionally much weaker in the House. It's not simply that they haven't got the numbers, actually, their capacity to propose things, to take control of the parliamentary timetable is very, very limited. And to some extent, their priority is not really to improve the government's legislation, it's to make life difficult for government. So on neither side of the House is it the first priority to say, how can we take this bill and make it better? You know, how can we make it work more effectively? That's not what the opposition is there for. Whereas in the House of Lords, you have far weaker party ties. You have much less party discipline, because what do you do, even to a Conservative or Labour peer who's voting against you? You can't drop them from your list. You can't remove them from the House. So they have a greater degree of independence. And they do have an expertise that is often missing in the upper house. So in the last parliament, if you looked at things like, you know, the Rwanda bill, if you looked at things like the illegal migration bill, the challenge to parts of it that appeared to be manifestly unworkable, or to parts of it that appeared to breach Britain's international legal obligations, almost invariably came from the Lords rather than from the House of Commons. And to some extent, and this might support the argument for just getting rid of it, to some extent, members of the House of Commons know that the House of Lords will do this. So, you know, why stick your neck out to vote against a bit of a bill that you don't like if you're secretly hoping that the House of Lords will do it for you, and you can then sort of tut and say how anti-democratic they are?
Very interesting. We've had a couple of questions which look at the interaction between the House of Lords and devolution. So what are your views about Gordon Brown's proposals for reform of the House of Lords? And would reform be better done if there was fuller devolution to English regions, and that was carried out first for representatives from devolved regions to then attend a reformed House of Lords?
Yeah, so one of Gordon Brown's proposals was that you make the House of Lords a chamber of the nations and regions. And that's an idea that's been floating around for a while. It's often quite difficult to pin down exactly what it means or exactly what it would look like. But part of the idea was exactly that the House of Lords would become a kind of guarantor of the devolved settlements, and it would also be the place that managed relations between different kinds of devolved institutions. So there are different ways you could make that work. One way might be to kind of devolve appointments to the House of Lords in the first place. So you say that the Scottish Parliament, for example, can propose a certain number of members to the House of Lords, or the Greater London Assembly, or the Senate, whatever can do that. Another is that if you're going to have an elected House, that you have sort of guaranteed electoral representation for different parts of the country. It runs into some problems, which are not insuperable, but we have to think about them. One of them is that the UK is unlike any other multinational state in the world, in that it has one component part that is so much bigger than all of the others put together. So the United States has large states and small states, but it doesn't have a state like England that constitutes 83% of the population of the whole. So if you're going to have if you're going to recognize nations as entities, you have a bit of a problem there. So the solution tends to be to say, okay, we'll regionalize England. But some regions in England don't have very strong regional identities, and that makes it quite difficult to do devolution in those parts of the country. And if you talk to the SNP, they don't regard Scotland as equivalent to Yorkshire. They regard it as an insult to think that Scotland might be put on a par with Yorkshire and Lancashire and Somerset. So those problems aren't insurmountable, but they need a little bit more thought than perhaps they've received so far.
And a few questions on the interaction between the House of Lords and electoral reform, which we touched on in our conversation. How to maintain the primacy of the House of Commons and avoid the kind of gridlock we see in the United States.
So you want to tie that in with electoral reform, or the questions are tying that in with electoral reform, are they?
Yes. Yes. So if the House of Lords was reformed, or I guess the Commons was reformed, the electoral system in the Commons was reformed, and therefore you had a situation where both chambers had a claim to some sort of primacy, what would happen in that situation? Or if the Lords became fully elected, or both of them became elected on PR or something like that?
So the easiest solution, which is, I suspect, what would happen, is that in any kind of reform bill, you would spell out what the powers of the upper house were. And you would simply establish that it can't veto legislation, or it can't stop taxation, or you set out some kind of reconciliation procedure. So you could say, for example, if you want a strong House of Lords, but you still don't want gridlock, you could say, if the House of Lords rejects something, then the House of Lords can overturn that by the House of Commons can overturn that by a 2/3 majority, or that the House of Lords itself has to have a 2/3 majority in order to stop something that's gone through the Commons. So you set up some kind of institutional procedure there. The interesting possibility, I think, is that if you have different electoral systems for the lower and upper house. So one suggestion is that you have the House of Commons elected by first past the post, on the basis that in theory gives you strong executive government, but you have the House of Lords elected by proportional representation, so that you get a fairer spread of parties. The thing we don't know, I think, is that which of those would be seen as more legitimate by the public in the years that followed. It might actually be that the public prefers the chamber that's elected by proportional representation, because they can see more of themselves in that. If you are going to have a continuing scenario in which parties are winning big majorities in the House of Commons on 30–34% of the vote, then actually the case for it being able to overrule the House of Lords might become tricky. So we might actually find accidentally that having different electoral systems itself changes the sense of which chamber has a kind of moral authority, regardless almost of what it says in statutes.
And a question from Steve. Is it impossible to disentangle constitutional reform in the broadest sense from party political interest? Are there any interesting examples from history of surprising cross-party arrangements?
So there are examples in the past where reform happens on a cross-party basis. Actually, probably the most important example would be women's suffrage in 1918, which, because you've got a wartime coalition and because the party leaderships are consumed with the war efforts, the problem of the electoral system is just handed over to a speakers' conference, which is a kind of cross-party commission, and they come up with a whole set of proposals, which includes votes for women, which commands cross-party support. That's really difficult. That's obviously a very unusual scenario. You can create royal commissions, you can hand things over to select committees, but ultimately, I'm not sure that we do want to take this outside party politics, because ultimately it's only going to pass if a party with a majority in the House of Commons wants it to. So most major reform does happen because a party sees an advantage to itself in tackling a problem in front of it. So realistically, in all sorts of ways, I would like it if there was a cross-party commission, there was cross-party agreement on what the future of the House of Lords should be. You're more likely to get change, I suspect, if a party puts in its manifesto that this is what we're going to do and wins an election on it.
And a question from Iski Gordon. From the point of view of democratic need, why not be bold and have a House of Citizens in the form of a permanent citizens' jury or a permanent citizens' assembly?
So I guess the question there would be, I should say there is a long democratic history of the idea of sortition, the idea that rather than having electoral processes that get controlled by organised parties, you simply select people at random. That's still how jury service works. The jury system is an intensely democratic institution that says that you will be tried by a randomly selected body of your peers, and they'll be picked out of a hat. So you could, in theory, have an upper house that did exactly that. I guess the question first would be, are there lots of people out there in the country who want a letter to land on their doormat telling them that they're now going to spend the next 2 years in London as a member of the House of Lords, or whatever we call it? I do wonder whether the appetite for that is really there. But I absolutely agree with the questioner that some kind of use of things like citizens' assemblies would be a fantastic innovation for the British Constitution. We have to find ways to make people feel more ownership of our democratic institutions. We have to find ways of debating democratic questions that aren't instantly framed as subjects of party warfare. And I think that citizens' assemblies are potentially a very good way of doing that. I think the experience of Ireland on the abortion question is a really good example of that. Our system is increasingly struggling to handle big ticket questions, like Brexit, obviously, or indeed questions like climate change. And I think we should be experimenting at least with citizens' assemblies and then learning from experience and seeing where that takes us.
It's interesting you mentioned sort of almost the tone of debate. I mean, obviously in the House of Commons, very adversarial, but I mean, I don't watch Parliament TV enough, and maybe I should do more. But whenever you see the House of Lords sort of in discussion, if you like, as opposed to sort of in debate as such, there does seem to be a different ethos around how things are talked about in that chamber, which stark contrast to members of the public say to me the pantomime that goes on in the House of Commons. So it's interesting, again, pros and cons. Last few questions before we wrap up. One of them is from Christopher. Do you feel a partly elected and partly appointed second chamber would be a step towards democracy and not compromise the House of Lords' current roles? So part elected, part appointed.
So that tended to be the model that most reform proposals have gone for, that you have not a wholly elected House, but that you have some proportion between perhaps 20 and 80% that will be elected. It's an interesting proposal. I think the danger is that you end up with two radically different types of representative. You have representatives that have a direct democratic mandate and representatives that don't. And I wonder what happens then when you get a contentious vote in which, say, the government is defeated on a particular proposal, but it would have won if only the elected members had been able to take part. And of course, it's true to say that the House of Lords right now has people with different kinds of mandates, but none of them have the kind of nuclear power of the vote behind them. And I wonder whether it's plausible to have a House in which some members can hold up, what is the most powerful force in our politics, which is the mandate of the vote, and others don't. So I'm skeptical on that, but I think that's quite a likely outcome if we do have change. So it will be interesting to see how it works.
A question from Nigel, who's an expat in Holland. Elections reflecting what a subset of the electorate think on one particular day are not adequate to maintain democracy. Discuss.
Well, I think he's clearly got a point. If you think about any of the general elections that we've lived through, they generally turn on quite a small number of questions. So 2019 is obviously very much dominated by where do you stand on Brexit and where do you stand on Jeremy Corbyn. They are to some extent referendums on the leaderships of the parties who might not be there very much afterwards. And there is a sort of constitutional fiction that this then gives a democratic mandate to the largest party to do anything it wants for the next 5 years. And that clearly is a weakness of our constitutional system, especially because we don't have the kind of safeguards that, say, the United States has. We don't have an entrenched constitution. We don't have a Senate with the power of the US Senate. We don't have the kind of strong state federal system that they do. So we create majorities with enormous powers, and we sort of pretend that they have legitimacy for all sorts of questions that the public have never considered. And to go back to an earlier question, I think actually that's a reason why a second chamber is useful. Almost whether or not it has a direct democratic mandate, you need other players in the system that are able to sort of feed in opposition and feed in discontent. That's also, I think, where citizens' assemblies are useful. So I saw someone in the chat box commented that citizens' assemblies don't have democratic legitimacy themselves to make decisions. And, I think that's true. But the proposal isn't that citizens' assemblies can pass laws. The proposal is that citizens' assemblies sort of stimulate debate. They put forward proposals that have a certain authority behind them. They take the discussion of questions out of the party fight. And the more of these kinds of elements that we can feed in, then all of these things I think help tackle that problem, that there is a bit of a constitutional fiction at the heart of almost any democratic system.
Yeah, it's very, very interesting constitutional fiction, because certainly in my work, I increasingly encounter it being told this and experiencing this vast gap between representatives who are representative because we vote for them once every 4 or 5 years, but also how representative are they of the people of this country. I think that is increasingly a question that is put aside, talking so much about the House of Lords being representative or not because it's elected. How representative is any representative who is elected? I'm going to I want to hear what you think from that. And one last question after that. Sorry, Robert, go on.
Sorry, just to add a quick point there. One thing that's changed without legislation or intent is that there used to be far more by-elections in British politics. Until the early 20th century, there could be kind of 30, 40 by-elections every year, which means actually the House of Commons is changing constantly between general elections. You don't have polls, but you have by-elections that are telling you something about where the government stands, and it can wipe out a majority in the course of a parliament. MPs are generally younger nowadays. They are less likely to drop dead while in office. They're less likely to leave Parliament to do other things. So actually we've lost an element that used to refresh the Commons between contests.
Very interesting. We're nearly out of time, but I'm going to put the very last question to you that that has been selected. How do we get rid of the huge power of patronage of the current system confers on prime ministers in appointing House of Lords members, and instead get an appointment system which is genuinely basing appointments on merit and expertise? It seems to be a real sticking point, and perhaps if we could reform that, again, tinker with that, that could be quite a dramatic change, it seems.
It's a real problem. So when life peerages came in 1958, people did raise this. Isn't this a dangerous power to give to a prime minister? And the answer given from the front bench of the House of Commons was that we could rely upon the good sense of the prime minister. And I think probably we've busted that one. So I don't think we can accept a system in which the prime minister has unlimited patronage. But there's also a problem with just giving that power to a body that doesn't have any democratic legitimacy either. I wonder how many of us could name any members of the House of Lords Appointment Committee. Are we sure we want a system in which a group of anonymous people are picking one chamber of Parliament? So I think we'd probably have to say, if we're keeping an appointed House, that we still have a degree of political appointment, but we have rules around it. So perhaps there's a set quota, perhaps there's a cap on the numbers you can propose. Perhaps they have to be approved by a committee of the House of Commons. You could do quite small things, like say, for every appointment, you have to lay before the House of Commons a detailed statement of what the case for that person actually is, so that we don't have some of the appointments we've seen recently where we have no idea why this person was placed in there or what the service that they did was. So I think if it's an appointed system, I don't think you can get rid of the political dimension altogether, because in doing that, in a way, you're getting rid of part of the democratic dimension. But you have to think about what rules could you institute that would contain those patronage powers.
I think we're out of time, Robert. It's
Okay.
been really, really interesting to hear so much about the evolution of the House of Lords, the pros and the cons, which I think is always important to discuss, and also your take on how reform in one area maybe needs to be considered in conjunction with the other. I'm certainly left with new thoughts about democratic legitimacy, but also I can't really get out of my head the notion that the House of Commons isn't really scrutinizing things, but the House of Lords does. It's really, really interesting to have this discussion.
Well, thank you, and thanks to everyone for their questions.
Yes, thank you everyone to your questions. Thank you to Unlock Democracy for hosting both myself and Robert this evening. And yeah, it's been really interesting. Thank you for joining us on what is a sunny evening here in London. So do enjoy the rest of the day, and thank you very much for your time.